How to defund gender studies. Hey, it's Prince of Queens, and first things first, I want to let you guys know that the next episode of Patriarchy will be on this Sunday, March 10th at 3 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, and our guest will be Brian Martinez of Honey Badger Radio, so tune in here and think of some questions to ask him with Super Chats. Anyhow, I was thinking about Peter Boghossian's statement from the panel entitled, "Is Intersectionality a Religion?" that I briefly included in my video that I published Friday morning.
My answer would be very brief. We must work on a way to defund gender studies.
After he said that and I thought about it, I decided I would brainstorm a bit to try to figure out how would be a good way to do this. And then I realized that this could seemingly be completely easy, to the point where I have to wonder if nobody has thought of this before, and if there is some small loophole that makes this solution non-viable. What I'm thinking would probably be the best way to defund gender studies in universities would be to work with the already existing law of long-standing legal precedent and just use Title IX to point to the obvious conclusion that gender studies fosters, perpetuates, and trains university staff and students to be discriminatory towards males. Because Title IX is a two-way street, and it's been used to protect males as well as females at this point. Now, I'll admit, regarding this video of mine that you're watching now, I'll be the first person to point out that Title IX has been blatantly abused, even just in recent years, to allow universities to actively persecute mainly young males on universities who are accused of rape or domestic violence on campus, with Obama's federal directive that demanded that universities conduct what they call kangaroo courts and discipline these young men in ways that stay outside of the law, often in completely ludicrous mock trial-ish things. However, while that executive directive from Obama was a blatant misuse of this law spawned from creepy far-leftist authoritarianism, using Title IX to defund gender studies departments would be entirely what the law should actually be used for. Because, let's be honest, gender studies departments have an entire premise that is based around discriminating against males, as they are built on a foundation of patriarchy theory. Now, to be honest, I can't really think of a single possible way that somebody might be watching this video and not know the basics of patriarchy theory, but I'll repeat it just so that my bases are covered. First off, I want to point out that patriarchy theory technically isn't a theory at all, as it is demonstrably untrue. So it should really just be called patriarchy debunked hypothesis or patriarchy myth, but whatever. Patriarchy theory states that all men collude either consciously or unconsciously to oppress all women at all times, to privilege all males at all times. Well, there are about 500 specific definitions of patriarchy dreamt up by what I assume to be universally pathological and man-hating feminists who have fought to justify academic careers for themselves. The basic premise that I stated will be a completely common thread. So I'll just continue to read a few of the first ones. I'll do this by reading the first paragraph of the Wikipedia entry for patriarchy under feminist theory. Feminist theorists have written extensively about patriarchy either as a primary cause of women's oppression or as part of an interactive system. Shulamith Firestone, a radical libertarian feminist, defines patriarchy as a system of oppression of women. Firestone believes that patriarchy is caused by the biological inequalities between men and women, e.g. that women bear children while men do not. Firestone writes that patriarchal ideologies support the oppression of women and gives, as an example, the joy of giving birth, which she labels a patriarchal myth. For Firestone, women must gain control over reproduction in order to be free from oppression. Feminist historian Gerda Lerner believes that male control over women's sexuality and reproductive functions is a fundamental cause and result of patriarchy. Alison Jagger also understands patriarchy as the primary cause of women's oppression. The system of patriarchy accomplishes this by alienating women from their bodies. Now, due to those people probably having been exclusively members of the second wave women's liberation movement of the 1960s and 1970s, they sound to be something or somewhere along the lines of what current feminists would call white feminism, because of course it doesn't sound intersectional, and intersectionality rules academic feminism now, unless you want to be called a non-woke racist or whatever. Intersectional feminism, being technically coined by a wacky and similarly delusional black female lawyer named Kimberly Crenshaw in the late 1980s, also has about 500 sub-definitions itself, and I personally argue after studying history quite a lot that intersectionality is basically just a hodgepodge of various different postmodern, Marxist-oriented class conflict ideas that are all completely dated demographically, as they were originally dreamt up before World War II by the Communist Party of the United States. However, it should always be remembered that intersectional feminists prioritize three things above all else in the current year. Obviously, women will always be on top of any food chain that intersectionals designate as the predator/prey hunting grounds, and black queer women especially. But it should not be forgotten that Islamic people are treated as extra holy in this religion. Basically, women, black people, and Islamic people are ultimately the three most important ingredients to divinity. Though, of course, it should be stressed again that because of the particular and inseparable ties to feminism within the ideology of intersectionality, because that's where it came from, they speak very explicitly and particularly about patriarchy quite a lot. And I think that the best person that we should look to for a definition of patriarchy from the intersectionals would be the absolute matron saint, who is the black female Jesus walking the earth to these people, which would be none other than Bell Hooks. Now, before I continue, it cannot be stressed enough that Bell Hooks is an atrociously terrible author whose books are essentially unreadable unless you are trying to prove a point to somebody about being either super woke or about how you forced yourself through a book that literally seemed like what would happen if a sophomore in college was taking a gender studies course and somebody published the essays that person turned in into a novella-length book. Seriously, Bell Hooks is simply less technically talented as an author by a landslide than I was by the time I graduated college when I was 22. And while I did work quite hard on my writing classes, I was also a part-time stoner, part-time alcoholic who was also so ridiculously rebellious when it came to conventions that I majored in playwriting so that I could write basically like how my friends and I sounded when we were talking to each other. Bell Hooks simply can't write. There's numerous typos in her books, she has no skill when it comes to structuring a narrative arc for a chapter, nor even most paragraphs, and she seemingly just makes stuff up entirely to add supposed evidence towards backing up her points, such as referring to bizarre-sounding studies that were allegedly conducted, which always show how horrible males are, but she never cites what these studies actually were, who conducted them, or even an approximate time frame in which these studies were conducted. You know how when people think for even a few minutes about intersectionality and how it doles out merit to individuals based on their identities, which correlates to historically underrepresented populations within intellectual fields, they always end up thinking, so wait, according to intersectionality, I should be worshipping a black mentally challenged woman or something? And honestly, Bell Hooks is basically the closest thing to somebody that might come along and say, It's me! I'm the queen of intersectionality! Now that the preface about bell hooks is out of the way, we should look at her definition of patriarchy, which, for the record, as I recall, is by no means set in stone and might be slightly different according to whichever book of hers you end up reading. Patriarchy is a political social system that insists that males are inherently dominating, superior to everything and everyone deemed weak, especially females, and endowed with the right to dominate and rule over the weak and to maintain that dominance through various forms of psychological terrorism and violence. Not only an issue of violent action, gender bias is also consciously, unconsciously present in everyday assumptions, beliefs, and values. Examples include gender stereotypes, gender-based discriminatory practices, the socialization of gender roles, etc. This does not mean that every man is patriarchal. Once again, this is a conceptual view that anyone can perpetuate. Far from blaming men or seeing men as solely responsible for patriarchy, Hooks writes, we need to highlight the role women play in perpetuating and sustaining patriarchal culture so that we will recognize patriarchy as a system women and men support equally, even if men receive more rewards from that system. Dismantling and changing patriarchal culture is work that men and women must do together. Okay, but let's be real, bell hooks. You think that men, invented this thing, right? This is something that didn't just sort of happen, that women maybe came up with at the same time that men came... she thinks that men started dominating women, and then some women got, matriarch Stockholm syndrome from the patriarchs or something, because bell hooks does actually describe patriarchy as the single most damaging societal sickness all over the world in an earlier chapter of that book. So let's not, pretend that this isn't something where she's blaming men, because she is. And of course, her solution is feminism. Surprise, surprise. Okay, so now that we've read her definition of patriarchy, I also want to remind you again that there's nobody on earth that the intersectionals think of as more woke than bell hooks. And if you ever read her books, it only gets worse, as she's a vile, man-hating monster who thinks that literally every man is born as a pathological piece of garbage that accidentally abuses everybody around him by being a part of the alleged societal sickness known as patriarchy, which is why men need to be saved with feminism so that women stop being damaged by males and hurting each other, and animals probably too. Seriously, I actually read that entire book cover to cover, and while it was literally the most god-awful book I've ever finished, at least now I get to have the very satisfied intellectual bargaining chip of being able to tell feminists who told me around a dozen times to read this book that, hey, I've actually read it. It changed nothing I thought about feminism besides me making it think it was worse. And for the record, bell hooks isn't even vaguely intelligent. That all being said, bell hooks is very likely the single most taught feminist and gender studies courses to this day. And considering how vile and hateful towards men she is it not the business of Title IX as a law, not really so much an organization, to stop this type of trash from actively being taught at universities? I mean, it seems so obvious to me that I feel like there must be some catch that I'm not thinking about. But I look at the law and I think about what would happen if somebody were teaching some anti-black propaganda, for example, and I think that this would be shut down under some sort of civil rights law or another, or at the very least, would have the federal government withdrawing federal funding of any university that had such things at it. So why isn't this being done with Title IX and gender studies? Please, somebody explain. Perhaps it's legitimately been a case of simple fear. Maybe there's been conservative type intellectuals saying that Title IX should stop women's studies or gender studies from existing for decades, and these people were consistently ignored and accused of being sexist, so nobody else decided to finally consider what they were saying. But I don't know, for a long time people thought that feminists were harmless. But is it just me, or is the cat out of the bag that feminists who believe in the evil, omnipotent patriarchy are nothing more than a bunch of hateful female supremacists with a twisted and obviously untrue worldview? If all men really did collude consciously or unconsciously to oppress all women, why have they privileged them with military protection, putting them to the front of the line during disasters, dramatically more gender-exclusive social services that you can possibly name about every type of social service, affirmative action type programs, the right to not have their genitals mutilated as infants, dramatic favoring in family court, while women are subjected to far less violent crime and basically every other social perk that you can imagine in comparison to males. Obviously, claiming that males are privileged makes the exact opposite of sense, and using this notion to claim absurd things like that women cannot be sexist towards men because men have privilege, so women should be sexist against men, or whatever they're basically teaching. Okay, that is a 100% discriminatory stance. And since literally every gender studies department teaches exactly that as its metaphorical backbone, it's fairly safe to say that we could find a way to use Title IX to defund gender studies. We wouldn't even have to declare intersectionality or feminism to be a religion. Though, well, we could do that too. That's all I have to say for this video. If it made you feel hopeful about the future, that's actually what I'm here for. But I can't do this work without your help, so make sure to tip me on PayPal if you can afford it. Even $1, $2, $5 helps. And follow me on minds.com so that you can see it when I post my videos, as I post them all there, and stay tuned.